Now, I know it's feeling done, but don't give up now. Don't go put this on your bed just yet, even though it would be very tempting. At some point, it'll all start to fray if you do. Finish this last stretch, which is the binding. I'm gonna show you how to cut it and how to put it on your quilt. We're gonna miter the corners, and this quilt is going to be done. So let's get going. We're almost there. Okay, so I'm taking half a yard of fabric, and I've chosen this kind of trippy wow stripe from Tula Pink from her Moon Garden collection. And I'm just gonna go ahead and fold it in half because that's gonna make cutting it even faster. Now, there is a philosophy when making your binding that you should cut it on the bias so that you've got a lot more stretch to it. That way, if it's taking the corner, you don't see any puckering. It just stretches a little better. However, it's much, much harder to cut. So when you're first starting out, I think it's important not to bite off more than you can chew. We're just gonna cut this straight, and your binding is still going to look great. I've done both methods, and I kind of think the difference is negligible. So we're gonna go for the easier of the two. I'm gonna line up my fabric. Again, we're gonna square it up, make sure we've got a nice crisp edge. And typical binding is 2.5 inch strips. So I've got my fold line at the top here, and I'm just gonna cut over as many 2.5 inch strips as will fit, and then that way we'll have lots of binding to work with. Now, we're gonna end up with a bunch of different strips, and we're gonna need to sew those together so we've got one long continuous strip. And now we're gonna measure over 1, 2.5. This will feel like easy cutting compared to what you've been through. There's one. And go over again, 1, 2.5. And while I cut this, I'll just get you thinking about, you have a choice with your binding. We're going to machine sew on one side, and then you can decide if you want to sew it with your machine, the hole on the other side too, where you're going to see the stitches, or if you'd rather hold out and undertake hand stitching the reverse side so that you don't see the stitches. For a long time, I only machine stitched because I couldn't fathom hand sewing all the way around a quilt. That just seemed like too much work, and it is a lot of work. However, I did start doing it. And I gotta say, I really do love the result of not seeing any of the stitches. So you decide what's best for you. I'm gonna just turn this, and I'm gonna cut off that selvage. It doesn't have to be super perfectly lined up here because all of these ends are gonna get sewn together. Now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 strips. And we need to turn this into one really long strip. So I've got my machine. I'm gonna take my first strip and just lie it right in front of me, just like this. I'm gonna take my second strip, and I'm gonna put right sides together. So let's just line this up on the mat so we see it. And I'm gonna take it about 2 inches over and 1 inch down. And I'm gonna line that up. So we've got this sort of awkward T shape. And now what we're gonna do is sew diagonal from here to here. So if you need to, you can use your ruler, any ruler, just with an edge, and you can mark a line there. You could put a pin there if you want. And we're gonna sew from here to here. Before you sew, do a little check, a fold check. And see when I fold that over now, I'm gonna have a nice strip sewn together. And the reason we don't just go right sides together and put a 1/4 inch right here is because then we would end up with a big lump, like a straight line going over our binding, and it would be very noticeable. When you sew it like this on the bias, it spreads out that lump along the edge of the binding and makes it much less noticeable. So let's just bring this over to the machine and sew it. So regular presser foot, because it's not a 1/4 inch, it's just sewing right on that line diagonally. My stitch length is at 1.8. Okay, so with that line sewn across there, you now see when we fold it, we get this long strip, but we've got these little flaps, another set of dog ears we need to trim off. So you can take your ruler and just trim a 1/4 inch. So line up your stitches under the 1/4 inch mark on your ruler. And that's just scrap. And then you'll have just this other little set of dog ears. Trim off those dog ears. And that's how you attach your binding strips together. But that's the one at a time method. I'm going to show you how to do a bunch at once too. If that feels too complicated, just go back to doing this one at a time. But if you want to do it all at once, here's what to do. Lay out your strip, lay out your next strip, still make your T shape. What you always want to make sure is that you're going in the right direction, that you don't inadvertently sew it this way and then you've got back to front binding and it doesn't go the proper direction. So always do that fold test. If you fold it on the diagonal, does it make one long continuous strip? Yes, here it does. So we know that's the way we want to sew. So that's where we can put in our pin or draw our line. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my line and put in my pin. And I'm going to give it that fold test and I'm going to pull it over. And I'm going to go to the end and I'm going to line up my next strip. Right sides together. Face up, do the fold test, yep, one long continuous strip, put my line. Remember, you can pause this video to catch up, put in a pin, do the fold test, got it, and send it on its way till you get to the end, bring in another strip, right sides together. Do the fold test, yep, one long strip. Do that fold test again, yep, send it along. Last one, right sides together. Yep. Makes a long strip, do the line. Put your pin in. Now we're going to sew all of these at once. I'll start at the beginning. So that first one's already sewn. I'm going to find where I put that pin in, make sure it's the pin side up, and we are going to sew along that line. And we're actually going to chain stitch these. So here's the first one. So you kind of have this cross shape here. You don't back stitch, so it's just like quilting. Stop. Then when you get to the end, bring up the next one. You're going to have this loop. So you've got this, the end of this strip in your left hand, then you're going to bring your next one up, flip it over, so you kind of got this V going, so that you can see the next line and your next pin, and then bring it bring that loop to the machine. So one side is the first side is the incorrect side, the back side of the fabric, right side of the fabric, and then you're bringing over that cross and you're chain piecing these together. Like I said, if this feels confusing, you can go back to the one at a time approach. So slide your hand all the way along until you get to the next one. So you've got this strip in your left hand, then you're gonna, in your right hand, flip over the next one so that you can see the line. You've got this one in this hand. So back side, right side, bringing the line over to your machine. This way you're doing everything at the same time, kind of assembly lining it, and it will make things go quicker. As long as you can keep it sorted. So drag your hand along, find the next cross, flip it over with your right hand. There it is. Lay it out so you can see it. And then bring that over to your machine. And you're just sewing straight. Don't run over your pin. Okay. Come along. Flip it over. There it is. This is the last one. Pin out. Well, once you're comfortable you're going straight, you can take the pin out. Doesn't have to be right away. There we go. And that's the last one. So now we end up with this very random chain of binding, but that's okay. Just like with chain piecing, you're just gonna snip the thread in between all of them. And now remember what we did with that first one is that we had to trim off all of those flaps. So you got that nice even piece. So run your hand along. All right, we come to the first flap. Get your ruler, line up those stitches with your 1/4 inch line. Of course, I'm using the most gigantic ruler. If you have a smaller ruler, this would be a good time to use it. There we go. And I'm gonna just freehand and cut off those dog ears like that. And just give a test. Yep, we're still on a long strip. Pull it over, come to the next flap, line it up like it's, maybe I'll try using this little tiny one. Put that 1/4 inch line on there. Be careful with tiny rulers like this. It's so much easier to cut yourself. And I'm taking off those dog ears and looking good. All right, moving on to the next one. Lots of twisting, don't worry, that's happening to me too. Put those stitches, they're hard to see with that Deco Bob thread, it's so thin, but that's good. So stitches underneath the 1/4 inch mark, off it goes. And dog ear, those little corners. There we go. So just go ahead and cut off all of those flaps. Okay, that's the last one. All of the flaps are off. So we can finger press open all of the seams. And we're gonna take this over to the ironing board and press these for real. So this next stage of prepping your binding all happens at the ironing board. So we'll start by just pressing open those seams. Little shot of steam helps. Don't worry about ironing your entire binding right yet, because we have some other work to do at the ironing board here, and that's that we need to now fold this binding in half and press it. And press. I'm giving it a little steam. Bring it along. Just keep folding it in half and pressing it along the way. Try to make sure you keep your raw edges together. All right, almost done. Okay. Gosh, all these steps. This is why making quilts takes a while. Now what we're gonna do, just to keep things nice and neat and organized, is just roll this up. Just helps to prevent it all. You probably experienced a lot of like twirling fabric and looping and having to kind of sort it out. If we can just roll it even loosely here, once we've pressed it, it's a way to not have to iron it again and keep it nice and neat as we're attaching it to the quilt. I wish I had a quicker shortcut way of how to wind this up. Maybe you could put it on a drill, but for now we're just old-fashioned winding it up. Don't drop it or you'll cry. Sometimes I like to try different methods just to make it more entertaining for myself, but not one is any faster than another. Once you get a big enough roll, doing it like this is pretty good. The other thing this is good for is if you decide to make your binding at the beginning of the fabric cutting process and then hang on to it until you're ready, rolling it up like this will help you just preserve it and keep it for when you're ready for it to go onto your quilt. Oftentimes quilt kits will come with the binding fabric, and so if you're already cutting and you want to do this stage ahead of time, or if you've got a bit of time and you're like, oh, I could do a little part of that, but maybe you don't have time for the whole thing, you can do it and then just set it aside and know that it's gonna just be safe like this. So I try to put a pin right through to the middle. And you could do that on both sides. Or if you have a clip and you want to clip it instead, that's fine too. But just make sure it's not going to unravel if it gets dropped or anything like that. So that is your binding, and all that's left to do now is attach it to our quilt. Hi, welcome back. New day, power of editing. Now I'm going to attach the binding. So we've got it all rolled up here, and it's stayed nice and rolled up in the clips and the pin. And I'm gonna try to keep it wound up. There are tools, we've got them in the shop, that you can wind your binding around, which is kind of helpful, especially if you're not gonna do it all at once. So you might wanna check those out. But I'm just gonna go ahead and put my pin kind of, or my clips a little further into the middle of the binding so I can unwind a good stretch of it. I'm gonna attach the binding using the 1/4 inch foot. If you have a bigger machine that has AccuFeed and you have the 1/4 inch foot for AccuFeed, I would definitely use it here. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, just use your 1/4 inch foot. But if you do have AccuFeed, the 1/4 inch foot with AccuFeed is gonna allow you to have those feed dogs on the top and still maintain that 1/4 inch, which is perfect for attaching binding. So if you've got that, use it now. Otherwise, you're gonna be just fine with your 1/4 inch foot. And we're gonna start somewhere along the edge. It doesn't really matter where you start. You just don't wanna start at the actual corner. Like, we're not starting here. We're gonna start like here or here, not at the actual corner. So I'm gonna go ahead and drape my quilt over the table so I can take some of the weight. And I'm starting with a long edge. So I'm gonna start about, 6 or 8 inches up from the corner. And I'm gonna take my binding and we're gonna go rough side to rough sides. So rough edges together to start. And if you want to pin or put a clip, you can, but we're going to be working and feeding this binding directly onto the quilt. And I'm attaching my binding to the front of the quilt. And you've got a choice here. You can machine bind the entire binding. So that means machine quilting the front and the back. That means you're going to see the stitches somewhere on the front or the back. Or you can machine sew on the front, and then you're going to turn the binding around, and when it gets to the back, because you've got this fold here, there's no raw edge. Now, many people don't want to see the stitches on either side, so they decide to hand sew on the back. That way you're not seeing any of the stitches. But if you don't have the patience for hand sewing, I totally understand. I'm going to show you a trick for how you can machine sew on the back and make the stitches minimal, especially on the front of the quilt. For that, we're going to use the ditch foot. All right, I'll just give this a little pin here so I don't lose my spot. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on my machine. I'm going to put it at about a 2, my stitch length. Not as small as piecing, but not as large as quilting. Still want it to be pretty tight on there. And you're going to leave about a 2-inch flap here. You're going to start sewing about where I've got that pin, right about there. The reason why is when we come around to this side, I want to join up the ends of my binding here, and it's very hard to do that when it's already sewn down. So we'll go ahead and sew the 2 ends together at the end. So for now, we'll just leave, 2 or 3 inches here so that we can link the binding up. So for now, we're bringing all of our raw edges over underneath to our 1/4 inch foot. And we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch all the way down here. That way you've got just enough of a little binding edge, and you've got lots of room to flip the binding over to the other side. Now, I tend to end up having my binding rolled out enough that it can go onto the floor or onto a little shelf or table, whatever you've got here. I've got a little shelf. It usually ends up on the floor. You're going to want it down so that you can easily retrieve it and keep it flush along the edge here. So I'm just going to start sewing. And I am going to backstitch just at the beginning here. Just 3 or 4 stitches. You normally don't backstitch in quilting, but this is the binding and we want to make sure everything is nice and strong. And away we go. And this part is pretty easy. It's just straight sewing. Once we get to the corners, this is when we're going to start what's called mitering the corners to get those triangular edges. So get the majority of the quilt up onto your lap. Now that you've got it, the first couple stitches tacked down. And you're going to be doing a lot of putting it in place, putting it in place, putting it in place, flattening it out, putting it in place. The number one thing when you're attaching the binding is to just make sure there's not too much weight, that your quilt isn't pulling on your needle, and that everything here is staying nice and straight. So I've got about a foot before I reach the end. And we're going to leave about 1/4 of an inch when we get to the end of our quilt here. So I'm almost to the end. I'm going to stop sewing about 1/4 of an inch before the end. And I'm going to just back stitch. So I'm just going to turn down my speed. I don't need to be racing into this part. I do want to make sure it's about 1/4 an inch. If you need to mark it with a little pencil or mark or something, that's fine. And 1/4 of an inch, and now I'm going back, back, about 3 stitches. And then, so I've just got this wee bit showing, and that's just enough for me to miter this corner. So what am I talking about mitering the corners? Well, it just means getting that nice 90-degree angle. So I've got my whole row here, and this is why it's important not to unravel the entire thing, because mitering the corners means you got to move this up and down and all of that. So it's starting like this, okay? You've sewn on, you've got that just a little 1/4 inch at the end. Can you see that there? It's about a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and fold this. So I've got this 45-degree angle, like this diagonal line, basically. And I'm just going to finger press that. And then I want to fold it again so that it's flush here and finger press. And then what's going to happen, you can put a clip or a pin right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew along that 1/4 inch again. And I'm going to show you what happens to the corner. I won't make you wait until the very end. So let's sew it. So just watch if this is your first time. I'm taking that pin out. I'm going to sew just like I did that 1/4 inch. Just going to backstitch a wee bit and go ahead forward. Now you'll keep going here, but I just want to show you the outcome here so that you realize why we're doing this. So now we've got a little boxed corner, and when we turn it the right side, you get this nice perfect corner with the 45-degree angle here and the nice sharp right angle on the corner, and that's a mitered corner. Now, you don't need to stop sewing, and well, unless you want to see it for yourself the first time you do it, but you'll leave this just kind of dangling in the wind here until it's time to turn them all around and sew it on the back. So all we're going to do now is continue sewing. Well, you shouldn't really stop, but continue sewing that 1/4 inch all down this side until we get to the next corner, where we will do exactly the same thing. And when you're on a big straightaway here, if you've got speed control on your machine, this is probably where you can turn it up a little. Just make sure you can adjust. If you're having to adjust on the fly and it's too uncomfortable going at that speed, slow back down, but you've got to be able to adjust, or just stop and adjust like I am here. All right, getting close to the other end again. And I'm just going to sew, leaving that 1/4 inch. I'm going to backstitch at about a 1/4 inch. Okay, now let's miter that corner again. So remember, we're going up, and you're matching that diagonal line right at the corner. Give it a little finger press. And then we're going to fold down so that you've got a squared off edge. If you sew a little too far over, just take your seam ripper and poke out or rip out a couple stitches. You'll always catch the rest on the end here anyway. So I'm just going to put a pin here while I take it to the sewing machine. And again, 1/4 inch right there, and then we'll have that nice corner. And then just keep on going until you get to the next corner. Back stitching. And go ahead. If you are sewing along and you find, especially at where you've sewn your binding together and your seam is a little uneven, don't worry too much about that. As long as you're getting both sides of the binding underneath the needle and it's stitched down, if it in a couple of parts it's not totally flush, that's fine. You won't really notice it in the end. Okay, getting to the end. So we're going up, finger press, and okay, one more, another side here. And then one more corner, and then we're going to attach the ends together. You can see I'm always kind of like pinching with my thumb and my pointer finger here and kind of flattening with my left hand. And then when I get kind of close, you can kind of straighten things out again. Here's sort of a good example of what I meant by my binding being a little thicker here, because my seam was a little more crooked when I sewed it together. And then it kind of comes back over here. See, you can see the white of the quilt. As long as my seam is touching here, then I can pick it back up again. It's no big deal that it's dipping down a little there, as long as it's getting caught in the seam allowance. And 1/4 inch at the end. Okay. All right, so now we're close to where we've started, which is why we don't want to be starting right on the end. We want to give ourselves a little bit of maneuvering. So I'm just going to finger press that and just do it like you've done the other 3. The only difference here is you're going to go ahead and measure down the rest of your binding and then overlap until at least your stitches start, and then you can cut. So my stitches start right here, so I'll overlap. And I'm just cutting that. I got a little bit extra, no big deal. So once you become a little bit more advanced at attaching your binding, there is a technique for sewing your actual binding on the bias here too, like we did when we were attaching the binding. You'd leave a little bit more fabric and you'd sew, and you bring your sides together and you'd sew diagonal just like you did when you were attaching the binding. But because this is our first quilt and we're going to keep it nice and easy and doable our first time around, what we're going to do here is we're going to just open up our seam and we're going to put one inside the other. But first we're going to press this one down so we don't have a raw edge, and then we can take that starting tail that we left and just kind of secure it. So fold it over just where your stitches are starting. So it kind of butts up against each other there. You can kind of give that a press, finger press. And then fold, like kind of flop that starting piece into the ending piece and let it hug all the way around it. And now you have a little line here where it comes together. If you did the more advanced technique, like in future quilts, then you would just have the same diagonal seam as you had on all the other binding. But this is a great place to start with a beginner quilt, and that little line there is negligible. You'll barely notice it when it's all done. So you can put another little pin there if you like. And we're just gonna sew that last stretch just down past that pin and back stretch over it. Well, not over the pin, but over that spot. All right. Okay, I back stitched, just sewing that 1/4 inch all the way, just like we did. Now I'm coming up to that pin, so you can slow down a little and take that pin out. And this is where you might feel some bunching. If you do, just adjust and make sure it's still straight. You don't end up with, so that you kind of have that straight line. You don't want one side sticking out or pointing out. You want it to be kind of even. And then you're just going right over top, and then a little back stitch. And there, the front side of the binding is on. So we've got that first corner. There's our little stitch line. You can barely see when you're flipping it over. You're flipping over all of your corners now. If you want, you can take it to your ironing board and iron it all flat down. That's fine. And now this is where some sewing clips come in handy. Let's turn it all the way around. And I'm just going to start where I started before. You want to make sure that your binding is flipped over and you've got enough left over that it makes it all the way under, so that if you're going to machine sew the binding onto the back, that you've got enough room to catch it. You don't want it so close or right underneath the previous stitches, because there's a chance it could leave a little hole. So you want to take it right to the back. And now if you are going to machine bind the back of your quilt, you are going to see a row of stitches on this side. So you could change your bobbin thread. In my case, I could change it to like a green color. That way I don't see them as much. And I could leave my deco bob on the front, which is nice and thin, or I could change it to a white. What I'm going to suggest doing is, rather than turn your quilt over and stitch here, where you're going to end up seeing a row of likely uneven stitches on the front of your quilt, I'm going to suggest, if you have a ditch foot, it looks like this, and see how it has this gate right in the middle, and it kind of sticks out like that little fence. What that can help us do is, if we're sewing the back of the binding on, but we sew from the front, it's going to allow us to stitch right in the ditch. So we're going to run that gate right along the front of our binding, and then that way our stitches go right in this ditch. So that's a way of kind of hiding your machine stitching if you don't want to hand stitch. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to go ahead and change out my bobbin, and I'm going to find a thread that closely matches my binding on the back side. So I've got a thread here that sort of nicely matches the binding, and I'm just going to wind it onto a bobbin. Now, when you're machine stitching your binding, you're going to see the stitches somewhere. There's no two ways around it, but we can minimize the look of them. So I'm putting my white deco bob back on top, and I'm going to go ahead and attach my S foot. Now, if you don't have an S foot, you could use your G foot, which is the blind hem foot. It's slightly similar. It's going to give you a bit of that gate in the middle, but you just have to make sure your needle doesn't hit that gate. The S foot, it's totally open there, so you have more more space. This is not a very expensive foot, so if you need a ditch foot, just reach out to me at info@homemade.ca and we can get you one. It's not very expensive. It's a great one to have for your machine. So I'm going to attach it on here. And it really doesn't matter where you start, but I'm just going to start kind of where I started before. Okay, so I've got a handful of sewing clips here. And I'm just going to go ahead and clip basically as many clips as I have. And you want to make sure you're kind of keeping a consistent look to the front of your binding. You don't want it to be like super pencil thin here and then kind of getting thicker over here. You kind of want it to maintain a nice 1/4 inch edging to your quilt, especially where you're seeing it along the front. And then you will have just slightly more than a 1/4 inch on the back, but that's okay. So when you get it placed, you can give yourself a little, maybe 6 inches between your clips. It feels a little thicker where we've got that seam, so just kind of make sure that you notice that and adjust for it. The main thing you want to make sure happens is that when you're sewing in the ditch on the front, that you're sure to catch the binding on the back. Let's bring it over to the machine and try it out. And I'm not starting right at the end here. I'm starting about this far in so that when I get to the end over here, I can go needle down and pivot. So you'll see what I do there when we get to it. When you use the ditch foot, you don't have to use a special stitch. So when I put this in, you can see when I put the presser foot down, the ditch, that little black fence, is right in the inside of that binding. And the needle is set to go down directly beside, basically right where that ditch is. That's where the needle's going down. So let's sew a few stitches. And it's your job to make sure that the fence, this little black fence, is staying right against that binding. Take the clips off as you go. Now let's just take a look at what it looks like. So now you can see the little stitches are right butted up against. You can barely even see it. I'm kind of pulling it back now because the stitches are right in the ditch. See them there? You could lengthen your stitch a little bit. Doesn't need to be quite that small. I'm going to probably lengthen it going forward. And then on the back, you get this nice straight edge right along the edge of your binding. And because that thread is the same color, we're sort of minimizing the effects of machine binding if you do it in this way. You'll barely see these stitches because they're in the ditch. All right, let's keep going. So I'm just going to lengthen my stitch back to 2.4 and just carry on in that ditch. This foot honestly makes it a breeze. Now you can still stitch in the ditch if you have a regular presser foot. You just have to really be careful to keep your needle lined up against the edge of the binding. And I'm just taking my clips out as I go. I'm not even looking at the needle so much as I'm keeping my eye on the fence. That little black blade is what I keep calling the fence. And every so often, just take a look at your binding and make sure you haven't missed a spot. All right, here, look, here's an example of missing a spot. See how I'm sewing along nicely, and then maybe I took my clip out a little too soon, and now this didn't get attached. These stitches are too far over. So if that happens, that's fine. Just bring it back around, do a little better job clipping it in place, and try it again. The other thing you can do is, if you're finding that it's not, is you can slide your clips down if you're sewing slow enough. And then just check to make sure you got it. You can kind of feel with your thumb, you'll get to feel how far over, either with your finger or your thumb, you can kind of feel, yep, my binding's over far enough, or no, I'm feeling the edge, it's flipped. If you're having a really hard time, go and press it with your iron so that you get a bit of a fold there. But I try to not press it with my iron if I can avoid it, just because I like the rounded look. And just stopping and taking a look. Look how it's nice and even on that back side, and you don't even notice the stitches on the front. You can't ask for more if you're going to machine bind. Now, if you're going to sew the back by hand, you're going to bury the stitch inside the folded binding and attach it to the backing so you don't see any stitch at all. And it's really your prerogative what you prefer to do. Obviously, the machine stitching the binding, sorry, I just trim my threads. I try to trim them as I go here, because sometimes in the binding they get, as it frays, they get caught. Careful not to stitch on your binding too. That can happen if you're going too fast. So we're just about to get to the corner here. And I'm just making sure that I'm under all the way. And you can see I'm kind of flat here. You go ahead and fold that under. And give it a clip so that it stays under at that corner. Go ahead and clip this under, just to give myself a little bit more wiggle room here. So I'm going to take my needle right to the corner and finish needle down right in the corner. So the little fence is going to come off the edge a bit. I'm just going to go slow. Make sure my clip isn't under the... And if you need to hand wheel it so you don't inadvertently sew on the binding. So I'm right in the corner there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift my presser foot and pivot. I'm just going to turn my whole quilt so that I can start coming down the next edge. Presser foot down and carry on. Right in that ditch. And you'll do that on all of the corners. And you'll see I'm getting confident enough, and you will too, that you maybe don't even need the clips anymore. You can just be rolling it in place as you go, keeping a nice even binding. You can feel on the other side that you've got enough. Checking every so often just to make sure you haven't missed. No, it's all staying on. That's what we like. Okay, I'm getting to the edge again. I'm just making sure it's folded over with that angle. You can kind of see it's folded. And then I'll put that clip. And then again, once I get close, I'm just hand wheeling it to make sure I stop with the needle down right in the corner without sewing on the binding. And get going again. So you might get some of these little things, these little pieces of fabric strands of thread, just from it fraying on the inside. Just snip them away as you find them. And I'm just getting to the next corner, hand wheeling it. Just make sure you're not on the binding. I just moved it back a little bit. Press your foot up and just make sure you're folding it over and turning it around. Okay, so I'm getting to the very end now. I've got about 2 inches before I reach the end. So I'm just gonna make sure I'm nice and folded over. So I've got that nice 45-degree angle. And just bringing it right to the end again. And just hand wheel it so you're sure not to go over. And I'm gonna just turn it one last time and just go over those first few stitches again. And back stitch. That's great. Snip away any little threads. You've got those nice mitered corners on the back and the front. And the binding looks so good. I love that it took no time to do this binding. I didn't have to hand stitch it, and I'm not having to put up with seeing a big row of stitches on the front because I decided to machine bind on the back and then have the bobbin stitches here. No, 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 no. Stitching in the ditch is the way to go. You guys, you finished your first quilt. And I'm so happy to have finished it with you. I hope you have learned so much about quilting. And you wanna know what? Every quilt is a new project, but every quilt going forward from here on out will build on the skills in this first timer. So I hope you'll always remember the lessons you've learned here and go back to the videos whenever you need a little refresher. They're yours to use as often as you wish. Thank you for choosing homemade for your first quilt. I hope there are many more in your future. See you next time.